Now, this is going to be the first of two parts of a video that I will be recording for the apology. It has a bit more background information than what we've looked at previously, and so I think I should give a little bit more information here. Of all the readings that we will do this semester, the apology is probably the one that is the most famous and, strangely enough, the one that is the least rich philosophically, even if it's extremely important for the history of philosophy. So today's video will be frankly historical, yet it sheds light on the apology in a way that cannot be done without looking at the historical context. There is a considerable amount of background information which bears on a proper understanding of the trial of Socrates. I certainly would not defend the guilty verdict which Socrates received, but it was not unmotivated, though surely misguided. First of all, I should add that when I discuss the apology, Plato is not my only source. We have three important sources for the trial. Plato, who gives a direct account of more or less what Socrates said in the trial, probably cleaned up a little bit grammatically. Xenophon, a contemporary who was out of Athens at the time, but who returns after the trial and wants to know what happened to his mentor Socrates, and then becomes well informed about what took place and then wrote an account of it. And Diogenes Laertius, who writes much later, about 500 years later, so about 100 of the Common Era, but he had access to documents directly from the period that we have now lost. So we have to use Diogenes Laertius sometimes to get indirect access to lost documents. The Apology is a good example of the importance of historical context and of what is left unsaid. In fact, I think the key elements to the Apology are left unsaid. I've made the point previously, but I'll repeat it here. Plato is not writing for 21st century Americans. He is writing for 4th century, before the Common Era, Athenians, and he can assume a lot of background knowledge which we do not possess. Beyond this, there's also an interesting problem of foreign humor that is present in the Apology. There is some humor here, though it is easy to miss given the earnestness of the situation. Foreign humor is always a bit difficult to pick up on. Now, the main background information refers to the Peloponnesian War. It's a major war between principally Athens and Sparta that took place between 431 and 404 before the Common Era. Now, the way it is normally presented is simply that Sparta defeated Athens, and that's not quite correct. Athens is a much more dynamic society, is a much richer society. Sparta, in many ways, is a very strange and a very backward society, despite its present popularity because of their warlike qualities. In point of fact, what happens is Athens grows to be too dominant for the Greek scene. So a coalition of Greek city-states, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, eventually Syracuse, and even Persia, all together gang up on Athens to push Athens back down. And in fact, this point of Greek history reminds me a little bit of the arcade game Whack-A-Mole. Whenever one of the Greek city-states begins to emerge as a bit too powerful, the other city-states all come together and push it back down. Now, it's a very difficult war, but eventually Athens is defeated. A plague that struck Athens made this even worse for Athens, so that was one of the reasons that they were not able to win the war. Though it was a very close run thing. Athens very easily could have become the dominant power of the Greek world if it had won the war, and it probably would have become the equivalent of the Roman Empire some 400 years before the Roman Empire became fully established. Now, following the defeat of Athens in 404 before the Common Era, Sparta put in place an oligarchy, a government similar to its own, where you had a small group of people, 30, who ruled Athens in a tyrannical sort of way. But the war had been so hard and so bitterly fought that by the end of it, pretty much all the participants were exhausted. So rather than really occupy Athens, Sparta and its allies essentially went home. And once they went home, well, Athens pretty quickly had a rebellion and reestablished democracy in the year 403 before the Common Era. The short civil war, however, had been very bitter, with people on both sides of the war being associated with Socrates. And this is going to be one of the elements that is important for the trial. Now, the leader of the new government, the new reestablished democracy in 403 before the Common Era, is Anytus, who we saw briefly in the Meno. Now, Anytus, despite the fact that he's going to kill the father of philosophy, is not a bad politician. He is attempting really to get Athens politically back on its feet, and he pretty much succeeds in reestablishing rule of law in a very disordered Athens. In order to do so, however, he needs the civil servants who know how to run the state. Now, the problem is so many of these civil servants had been compromised by the actions of one administration or another, or one regime or another, where they had ended up committing crimes for the government of the day. In that kind of situation, pretty much the only way that you can continue to have a successfully running state is to declare amnesty. You basically, there's no way you can get around it. You need the people who know how to run the state at the right positions to run the state. And if they've been compromised, well, something has to be done to get beyond that point. So Anytus passes what is called the Act of Oblivion. The Act of Oblivion states that all events which occurred before 403, before the Common Era, are essentially dead from a legal standpoint. That means these events cannot be talked about in a court of law. Historians can talk about them, of course, but in a court of law, you can't bring somebody to trial for a crime that they committed in that period. So basically, there's this blanket amnesty, and this allows essentially the Athenian state to get back on its feet in a much quicker manner, and essentially reestablishes peace between the parties which had so recently been at war with one another. Anytus, as near as I can tell, only violated this act of oblivion once, and that is the trial of Socrates. The actual charges made against Socrates are codes. It is not that he is guilty of corrupting the young and of not believing in the gods in whom the city believes in. Rather, he is more guilty of association with certain members of the fallen oligarchy, and also with the famous traitor of Athens, Alcibiades. And moreover, he's associated with people who engaged in sacrilegious acts, especially Alcibiades in this particular case. And the charges are getting at these associates and these actions of his associates. In fact, it may not be too strong to say that in many ways the trial of Socrates in the mind of the Athenians was initially the trial of the ghost of Alcibiades, who today is unknown. Today we know Socrates, so we would tend to turn this around. Now, who are these associates of Socrates? Well, first of all, we have Critias. Critias was a childhood friend of Socrates. They grew up together. He's also the uncle of Plato and related to Plato. And Critias was at the head of the oligarchy. Basically, he was at the head of the government that Anytus just overthrew when he reestablished the democracy. The other associate of Socrates is Charmides. Charmides had been very close to Socrates, and in fact, I'm afraid I'm going to have to shock you here a little bit. Socrates even had been a lover of Socrates. These homosexual relations were fairly common in ancient Greece, especially among the aristocrats, typically with an older man and a much younger man, a lover and a beloved. Charmides was the beloved, Socrates was the lover. And Charmides, at the time of the oligarchy, had been their main general. So essentially, he was just defeated in battle by Anytus, and he was definitely no friend of Anytus. I might mention that these homosexual relations, which we today find shocking, somewhat shocking, I guess, the fact that they were so common among men who apparently were not homosexual is a bit shocking for us, really came from Sparta. Where Sparta had a very peculiar society where essentially the men lived in barracks separate from the women for most of the time. And this kind of separation seems to have facilitated these kinds of relationships. And later, as Sparta was kind of the hegemon and the model for other Greek city-states, this behavior was more or less imitated in other Greek city-states, and including Athens. So it's not, Socrates is not extraordinary in this regard. And moreover, the Athenian men, after having these kinds of relations, would still have wives and families and children and everything like this. And in fact, the ages were never the same. Yeah, it was always a much older man with a much younger man. So there always was this kind of asymmetry. You don't really find homosexual couples as we would today understand them. And finally, the real key person in the mind of the Athenians associated with Socrates who is a problem is Alcibiades. I will speak more about Alcibiades in the second part of my videos for the Apology.